Today we're talking about academic language, not just vocabulary words, but the language children need to participate in school, explain their thinking, understand texts, and communicate ideas clearly. Sometimes when people hear academic language, they imagine giant vocabulary lists or children speaking in overly formal ways. But academic language is really about access. It's about whether children can fully participate in their learning. Think about a kindergarten student trying to explain why a plant died. They may know exactly what happened, but not yet have the language to say the plant withered because it lacked sunlight and water. Our role as teachers is not to simplify learning down to the point where language disappears. Our role is to scaffold children into increasingly complex language while keeping instruction meaningful and joyful. So today we'll especially focus on multilingual learners in culturally diverse classrooms because language and culture are deeply connected. So for this warm-up activity, I want you to think about what kinds of language do children need to be successful in school besides everyday conversation. So there's some possible responses there on the screen. So I want you to think about what these possible responses might look like in action. So a child explaining their thinking, a child asking questions, retelling stories, comparing ideas, writing opinions, using content with vocabulary. A child might be fluent socially. They can play, they can joke, they can chat with their friends, but still struggle with academic language demands, like explaining a math strategy or understanding informational text. An example might be that a child can easily say, "I played soccer yesterday," but they may struggle to say, "I solved the problem by grouping the tens together first." And this gap matters instructionally. So what is academic language? Academic language is the language of school success. It includes vocabulary, but it also includes sentence structures, ways of organizing ideas, discussion norms, and even the kinds of language different subjects require. So for example, science language often explains cause and effect. Math language explains reasoning and comparison. Literacy language includes retelling, inferencing, and analyzing characters. And academic language is developmental. We don't expect kindergartners to sound like middle schoolers. Instead, we support children in moving them from simple to complex, conversational to precise, and implicit to explicit. One misconception is that children acquire academic language naturally just by being around school. They don't. It requires intentional teaching. So an example might be a teacher might intentionally model the language, "I predict the character feels disappointed because," instead of saying, "I think she's sad." So you see the distinct difference there, using academic language to describe what's happening rather than just making an inference. So it just takes it a step further. Language and content are absolutely learned together. One of the most important ideas today is this. Children learn language through content and content through language. So we've talked a little bit in this class about up until third grade, children are learning to read, and then third grade and beyond, children are reading to learn. But children are learning content from like very early ages, right? From the time they are born, children are learning. And so these can't be separated. We do not wait for children to become fluent in English before we expose them to science, social studies, math, or literacy instruction. So imagine a first grader learning about butterflies. They're simultaneously learning a science concept of metamorphosis, sequencing language, right? What happened first, next, last? They're learning vocabulary like chrysalis and larva. And they're learning about explanation of structures, like I said, first, then, and last. This is especially critical for multilingual learners because historically schools often reduced rigorous content while students were learning English. Research tells us that the opposite approach is better. High support and high rigor. So an example of this might be a teacher saying, turn and tell your partner how the caterpillar changes during metamorphosis using the words first, next, and finally. And then you're really working on teaching science and language at the same time. Teacher talk is incredibly powerful because children borrow language from us before they independently produce it. Think about how often children repeat phrases they hear adults use. Do you remember when we talked about telegraphic and formulaic speech last week? That's the same lines. They actually repeat the phrases that they hear their peers use and that they hear adults use. They use phrases like actually, or I disagree because. Can you explain your thinking? So the more that you use those phrases, the more children are going to repeat them. They're learned through exposure and interaction. So effective teacher talk models rich vocabulary, expands student language, provides repetition, and makes thinking visible. So a student might say, the plant died, and the teacher might follow that up with, yes, the plant wilted because it did not receive enough water. Notice that the teacher validates the child, introduces academic vocabulary, right? Wilted, did not receive enough water, models a complete sentence, and connects cause and effect. Another example for teacher talk might be praise, right? So how many times do you catch yourself saying, good job? That's fine, but it doesn't really give the child a whole lot to hold on to. So maybe instead try, I noticed you used evidence from the text to support your idea. And this really teaches the language of thinking. Modeling academic language. So children need to hear academic language repeatedly before they can use it independently. Modeling lowers cognitive demand because students are not trying to invent language from scratch. So one strategy is the think aloud. An example would be, I'm noticing the character keeps looking out the window. That makes me infer she may be waiting for someone. So then there, you're modeling vocabulary, syntax, and a cognitive process all at once. Another strategy is recasting. A child may be sad, him goed outside. The teacher might respond, yes, he went outside to investigate. So the teacher does not shame the student or force immediate correction. Instead, they model the correct form naturally. You can also demonstrate discussion norms and show how to explain reasoning. All right, so last week we talked about the importance of home language and culture, and we're really going to drive that idea home here today. One of the most harmful myths in education is that home language interferes with academic English development. It does not. Research consistently shows the opposite. Children's home languages strengthen cognitive flexibility, support literacy transfer, preserve identity, and deepen comprehension. When schools devalue home language, children often receive the message, who you are is not welcome here. And we cannot make room for that. That cannot exist in your practice. It affects learning deeply. So culturally sustaining practices in teaching means that we treat students' languages and experiences as assets. So some examples of this in your classroom might look like bilingual books, family storytelling traditions, multilingual labels, allowing translanguaging, connecting lessons to students' cultural experiences. So an example, a child may discuss an idea in Spanish with a partner before sharing in English. That's not cheating, that's language processing, and it's important. All right, let's get to business here. We're going to talk about the levels of academic language. We're going to look at academic language through 3 interconnected levels: discourse, the sentence level, and the word and phrase level. You're not developing these independently of each other. You are helping children develop these simultaneously. A child may know vocabulary, but still struggle organizing ideas into connected speech. And so the only way that we can get there is if we are using that vocabulary in connected speech. They may understand ideas, but not yet produce complex syntax. So we need to analyze language demands at all three levels when planning instruction. All right, the discourse level. This refers to how language is organized across larger stretches of speaking or writing. This includes the genre, the organization of text, the cohesion, transitions, voice, and perspective. Different school tasks require different discourse structures. For a narrative, it might sound like, first the bear woke up, then he searched for food, and finally he returned to the cave. Informational might sound like, bears hibernate during winter because food becomes scarce. An opinion might sound like, well, I really like brown bears because they live in my neighborhood. So just an opinion, right? The sentence level is when we focus on syntax and grammatical structures. Young learners move from simple sentences towards increasingly complex ones. So a simple sentence might look like, the dog barked, or the frog jumped. Or a compound sentence might sound like, the dog barked and the cat ran away. And a complex sentence might sound like, the dog barked because it heard a noise outside. And you could see on the screen there, I used the frog jumped and the frog jumped into the pond because it was startled. Academic tasks often require more complex syntax than conversational speech. Last week, we talked about sentence frames, and we're going to talk about those again this week. And a sentence frame that is academic and task-oriented might look like, I agree with blank because blank. That tiny frame supports argument structure, syntax, and reasoning. And in the module this week, you will see that there is a packet of examples if you need to get started, if you need something to kind of grip onto as you're planning a lesson. So look for that in the module this week. There's a packet of many examples. All right, the word and phrase level. This includes vocabulary, figurative language, idioms, and word meanings. Many school words are tricky because they mean different things in different contexts. Some examples might be the words table, right? A table can be something you set belongings on. It could be a chart. It could be, it could mean to set something aside for a later time. Another example is the word plot, right? A plot could be on a chart. It could be a plot of land. Another word would be volume, right? The word volume could represent the overall sound of something. It could also represent a mathematical term. So those are some examples of how different words mean different things in different contexts. And I'm sure that you can think of many, many more. Let's talk about idioms. Idioms can be confusing for multilingual learners and for all young learners. Examples of idioms are things like hold your horses, that was a piece of cake, or she's feeling under the weather. Young children oftentimes interpret things literally. And so when you say hold your horses, they're thinking of, well, where are my horses to hold? Not hold on, take a beat. That's take a beat is another idiom, but just remember, children take those literally. Just avoid using them. We actually avoid using idioms in higher education too for the same purpose. They're confusing to multilingual learners. And then some nominalization examples. Nominalizations are when a word takes on a new form to mean the verb. So a nominalization of decide is decision. Compare, comparison are for some examples of nominalizations. And then academic texts do use nominalizations constantly.